it seems there is no getting away from fraud, conversations about cybercrime and cyber fraud.
Here in the United States during the pandemic, and in other countries, there were stimulus programs that were designed to keep the economy open, but they became like these money piles.
It started during pandemic. Where does this stop?
Why do I think it's going to get worse? Is because, number one, there's so much money being made by these criminal organizations, whether they're in Southeast Asia or they're in Nigeria doing Yahoo Boy finance scams.
So I said, why is that? Why do you take deepfake work? And he said, I make a lot of money on it.
I see the same thing on Telegram that are designed to kind of be AI deepfakes as a service. There's two types of deepfakes. There's video deepfakes and there's audio voice clone deepfakes.
ChatGPT 4.0 was released. It was very buzzy. It can suddenly see us, hear us, respond emotionally. I don't have the staff to be focused on security 24/7. Hello and welcome to Beyond the Algorithm. I'm your host, Aarti Samani. I work with executives to incorporate AI into their business strategy and run awareness workshops on AI risks and cybersecurity. I also talk about it a lot at conferences, at corporate events, and here on this show. Today we are venturing into the critical topic of cybercrime. It is rising at an alarming rate, and every day we hear news stories of sophisticated scams, data breaches, and new fraud tactics. But what is driving this surge and how can we protect ourselves? The topic is vast and complex. There are many factors leading to the proliferation of cyber fraud. AI is the biggest contributor, but along with technology, social engineering plays a major role. Did you know in Q1 of 2024, 90% of successful attacks involved human manipulation? Cybercrime as a service is a growing industry, and there is a whole shadow economy around it, a very lucrative one at that. Small businesses are caught in the tight clutches of ransomware attacks, and security technology is just not able to keep up pace of fraud innovation. The environment is like nothing we have seen before. In these situations, it is important that we bring as much information and awareness as possible. And that's why I have a very special guest on the show today. His name is Frank McKenna, a lifelong fraud fighter. Frank started his career in 1990 as a fraud analyst and investigator and has been working with financial service businesses the world over. At present, Frank is the co-founder and chief strategy officer of Point Predictive, an organization that focuses on solving application fraud for the lending industry. Frank on Fraud is a personal blog that he writes and one that I read diligently. Frank, welcome to Beyond the Algorithm. I am so delighted to have you as my guest today.
I'm super happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Let's dive right in and talk about what I call fraud tsunamis. So it seems there is no getting away from fraud, from conversations about cybercrime and cyber fraud, whether I'm speaking to a friend or whether I'm opening my social media or looking at news channels. It seems to be all around me. What is driving this explosion of cybercrime and cyber fraud?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think to understand what's happening right now, we have to kind of rewind and go back maybe 4 years to the pandemic. I think the pandemic was really transformational across the world. Here in the United States during the pandemic, and in other countries, there were stimulus programs that were designed to keep the economy open, but they became like these money piles that all the fraudsters tried to gain access to. Here in the US, the estimates are 1.6 trillion was stolen from the government. And if it was just the money, that's one thing, but I think there was a cultural transformation that happened with the pandemic. We saw a lot more people on social media sharing the methods of how to commit fraud. By my own estimates, I think there's about 1 million new fraudsters that were radicalized just here in the US alone. Even though the COVID money dried up, they never quit their day jobs. There's all these channels now. There's Telegram, there's Instagram, there's Facebook. These fraudsters can all communicate with each other in real time, basically supercharge scams and frauds. That's why you hear about it all the time, is because there's so many more fraudsters that are communicating with each other, so much more. So it's created this tsunami of fraud. I like that word that you used, Aarti, because I think that's what it is.
Yeah, it's scary, isn't it? So it started during pandemic and it has continued. Now we are post-pandemic and have been for best part of 18 months. Where does this stop? Is there an end to this, or will we see a continual exponential compounded rise of the fraud that began back in 2020?
So I don't think that it's going to end anytime soon. And I think it's just going to get worse. Having been in fraud management for, 30 years, that's been the progression for the last 30 years. It's gotten worse and worse each year. And I've never seen anything like what we have now. Why do I think it's going to get worse is because two things. Number one, there's so much money being made by these criminal organizations, whether they're in Southeast Asia doing pig butchering, or they're in Nigeria doing Yahoo Boy finance scams, or in India doing impersonation scams and tech support scams. These organizations are making so much money that all that money is getting plowed back into new ways to commit fraud. So unfortunately, I think we may just be in the beginning, and it's probably just going to get worse year over year.
So I had an interesting experience recently. I was on one of the freelance working sites where I was looking for a video editor, and I reached out to one individual. Before I give my work to these freelancers, I like to ask them their background, understand a bit about their work. And I asked him what kind of work he was mostly taking on, and his response was deepfake. So I said, why is that? Why do you take deepfake work more? And he said, well, I make a lot of money on it. I get $200 a day just creating deepfake videos. So my thinking was, oh, that's interesting. What do they use these videos for? You clearly know that these are deepfake videos. You're creating them. Do you know what they are used for? And he said, yes, they're mostly used for scams, sometimes for social media, sometimes for advertising, but it's mostly for scams. So this individual who's on a freelance website, video editing, often gets asked to make deepfake videos which his clients are using for scams, and he knows it. But he does it because it is quite lucrative. So even at a very superficial level, the money, the economy, it's a very lucrative business.
It is crazy. Yeah, I'm surprised that you were able to find that. I think that's just the tip of the iceberg, though, right? Because I see the same thing on Telegram. There are a lot of new channels that are designed to kind of be AI deepfakes as a service, especially in areas like pig butchering, where they're romance scams where somebody has to fool the victim. So it's interesting, this whole kind of shadow economy is emerging around deepfakes and AI because they have a skill set that's in demand by these scammers. So I imagine that's just going to be a growing industry. So it's quite frightening that there's so many of these happening right now. I think it's just like you said, this is probably just the beginning or tip of the iceberg of what we're going to see in the years to come.
Let's talk about multimodal attack vectors. So scammers have so many options now, right? Technology is at a very interesting point. We as individuals are very attention deficient. We are multitasking all the time. There is busyness in life. We consume media on different channels simultaneously. There are asynchronous communication platforms, etc. And then a whole bunch of niche platforms like Telegram and others to launch attacks from. So it seems like it is a very fertile ground, more so than we've had in the past. So tell us a little bit about the attack landscape and how all the different factors come together to launch multimodal fraud.
Yeah, it's a good question. So if you talk about the backdrop really is increasing cybercrime and fraud, and then you start to talk about the different levels of, all the ways that they are committing that fraud, there's so much to it. I mean, if we think about the different types of attacks that they have at their disposal, there's social engineering, right? This has been around forever, but it's just getting that much better. Social engineering somebody by impersonating them through the use of deepfake technology. So if we think about deepfakes, there's two types of deepfakes right now that are quite popular. There's video deepfakes and there's audio voice clone deepfakes. And they're being used in a variety of scams. Right? We're seeing them emerge for BEC fraud. We're seeing them emerge for kidnapping fraud or AI, using kind of ransom where somebody calls claiming to be the son or daughter, and you pick up the phone, you think you're talking to your son or daughter, but it's just an AI voice. There's other types of emerging scams that are emerging with the use of these deepfakes. The problem with the deepfakes right now is they're not necessarily multimodal. They're kind of one-dimensional. So you can do a pretty good deepfake video, but you have to record it and play it back. So it's not really real time. It's not interactive. And then you can do a pretty good audio, but then that's a separate type of attack. It doesn't really come together in real time. And I think when it comes in real time where, you and I already could be two robots talking to each other or AI robots, that's when it's going to get really dangerous, when it's a back and forth conversation where you're actually talking to somebody and you think you're looking at them, you think it's them, it sounds like them, but it isn't them at all.
Interesting. You talk a lot about digital doppelganger, right? Tell us your thinking there and the work that you and your team have been doing on that.
Yeah, digital doppelganger is basically a digital twin. So when we talk about a digital doppelganger, it's somebody that has all of your mannerisms. It looks like you. It sounds like you, and it is an exact replica of you, but it's digital. And anybody right now can create this digital doppelganger using tools like Agen, where you can actually create these now for $20 a month. You can get access to the system. They'll clone your voice, they'll clone your image, and you can actually use this to create an avatar of yourself. And they're quite popular, and I've done them myself. The digital doppelganger is something that is going to explode over the next few years. In fact, Zoom, I think there's a recent interview with the CEO of Zoom who said in the next couple years, you're going to be able to join a Zoom call with your digital doppelganger, your avatar. So the only thing you're going to have to do is take the notes from the meeting and respond to people. Your digital twin will be out there in the world, and it can be quite productive. But at the same time, if somebody gets a hold of your digital doppelganger or creates one independent of you, they can make you say or do anything they want and fool the world. And that's where I think digital doppelgangers can get pretty frightening, is in the way that they're used without your permission.
What should we do about it? Should product makers like Zoom take some responsibility just because we have the technology at our disposal? Does it mean we should deploy it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think if you look at AI, it's tremendously powerful. But like Pandora's box, once you release something into the wild, it takes a life of its own. I think ChatGPT is a really good example of that. I think it was the end of 2022. Yeah, end of 2022, they launched ChatGPT, but within 30 days, the ChatGPT had been jailbroken. So fraudsters and criminals had found a way to bypass all of the controls that OpenAI put into the software to be able to make the AI do things that were really harmful, like creating malware. So you can type into these jailbroken ChatGPT, you could say, write me Python code to create malware, let's say a keylogger that can be installed on a computer. And without having any coding experience whatsoever, you could become a hacker. You could become an expert phisher by typing in, write me an expert phishing email, pretending I'm from Chase Bank. So all of these AIs can be jailbroken. So it's a little bit like Pandora's box. I think what can companies do? I think they can put in controls, like 11 Labs is a good example. They have been accused of being the company that enabled a Joe Biden deepfake. And it was a pretty damaging deepfake here in the United States, where a magician had uploaded Joe Biden's voice, created a clone, and created a robocall, which then they blasted out to thousands of voters in New Hampshire to suppress the vote, getting people not to vote using a voice clone. 11 Labs has taken measures partnering with AI firms to detect when this is happening so that they're not uploading and using celebrity voices or politicians' voices. Those are the types of things that companies can do. But more so, I think it's probably up to governments to be able to regulate the penalties and regulate the use of AI as well.
That could be a long way away, though, given how long it took the EU AI Act to be formulated and then eventually to come into force. So it feels like a multi-pronged approach with governments, private organizations, and individuals taking responsibility for all of this. Going back to the different types of attack vectors, you mentioned BEC, which for our audience is an acronym for business email compromise. You mentioned ransomware, deepfakes, social engineering. Can you help us understand some of the nitty-gritties of this? So how does a ransomware attack manifest, for example, and what is the impact on individuals?
Yeah, so if we talk about a ransomware ransomware attack and how does that manifest in an individual, and in particular on how AI could be used. So typically in a ransomware attack, it's typically going to start with an email that is sent to an individual. And AI can be used to create that email. And that email within it has an embedded link that if you click that link, it will spawn malware on your computer. So AI can also be used to create the malware that is within that link. So without having any experience, you can be, let's say, somebody from Nigeria. You can send an email to somebody in London, in the UK, or here in the United States. And that email is completely crafted by artificial intelligence. And the link that has embedded malware in it, that code is created with AI as well. So they can send this email out to tens and thousands of people, maybe even millions of people, also using artificial intelligence. And they can now have that email going out, and the odds of somebody clicking that link is very high, especially if that link looks really genuine. So when people click that link, the malware will launch, and it can do a variety of things. Number one, it can steal your passwords, so that if you are logging into your bank account, it can steal your password and your username as you log in and send it back to the hacker in Nigeria. And then they can log in as you after you log off. Manifest itself, if you work for a company, in gaining access to your network, your company's network. And that has even more catastrophic consequences. That means, like here in the United States, about a month ago, hackers were able to use the malware, what they call InfoStealer, to be able to hack into CDK. And it took down about 50% of the dealerships here in the United States for 3 weeks. So 50% of the car dealerships in the United States lost connectivity because of these ransomware attacks. They're growing like crazy, but AI is just going to supercharge them.
And what is the ask? They're launching these attacks. They are stealing information. They have access to data. They have access to passwords, perhaps even personal information. And they have the potential to bring down, like you said, several dealerships lost a lot of business during that process. What are they asking for in return? And how are they communicating with the victims?
And this is the fundamental thing I think about all scams and fraud and everything. The ask is always money. So what they want is, what they typically do with ransomware is two things. There's a threat of releasing the data into the public domain. So one of the things that they're going to do is they're going to contact a company, typically via an email, maybe a text. They're going to send an email and it's going to say two things. Number one, I'm going to release your data to the public domain. And number two is I'm going to lock up your systems, because they infiltrated the network. They have the power, and they often do this, is they lock the system down, bringing the whole system down. So if you have customers like CDK, where we talked about 15,000 dealerships losing connectivity, is because they locked the system down. So they threatened, CDK with, we're going to expose all the data on the systems, and we're going to lock the systems down. And we're going to demand, I think that what they had demanded from CDK was $50 million. So they want money to not release the data and to open the systems back up. And they're communicating these things, via written channels like emails and text and things like that.
And what happens if you don't give in to this? So how do we know whether they're calling our bluff, or are they serious and they're actually going to execute what they're saying they will do?
There's an interesting case study a few weeks ago, actually, here in the United States, where a ransomware hacking group out of Russia contacted the Federal Reserve, claiming to the Federal Reserve that they had over 3 terabytes of data that they were going to release to the public. And the Federal Reserve told them, and they were demanding something like $25 million. And the Federal Reserve kind of called their bluff and says, we're not going to pay, or we're going to pay $50,000, some small amount, given the amount of data, 3 terabytes of data that was going to be released. And sure enough, the Federal Reserve is right. They didn't actually have the data. But the data that the ransomware group had was actually part of another bank. I think it was Evolve Bank here in the US. And they actually did have Evolve Bank's data. I guess maybe they'd mistakenly thought it was their Federal Reserve data, or maybe they were trying to extort money from the Federal Reserve and they were unsuccessful. So really, the way that the hackers typically prove that they have access to the system and the data is by locking the system down. And that's how they prove to the companies that they have the data and that they are serious. What happens if you don't give in to the hackers, you have two options. One is to try to restore the system through backups. The second is to pay the ransom. And many companies, I think it's 30 to 40% of the companies will pay the ransom, and 50 to 60% will actually try to get the system back up and running using backups and other methods.
And in that case, the data is still released on dark web for further attacks, perhaps? Is that how it works?
If you don't pay the ransom, typically, yes. The threat of releasing the data into the public domain is real. In fact, that's why you see so many data breaches this year, almost close to 100%, at least here in the US with data breaches, because the ransomware attackers are releasing that data into the public. So yeah, your data is going to get released. If you pay the ransom, there's a chance that it won't get released. That may only be for a year, because they could go back and re-extort you again, a double extortion, they call that. And just because you pay the ransom doesn't mean it's over.
So how do you break out of that cycle? Once you're in that cycle, once you're in the clutch, are you there forever? And do you periodically expect to be contacted for more money? How do you come out of it?
Well, I think it's up to the group that you're dealing with, right? I think it's still too new. That's a really good question, but I don't think we know enough about the re-extortion because ransomware has exploded in the last few years. So we haven't seen that re-extortion be dominant yet. I imagine it's going to happen. And how do you break out of the clutches? You kind of don't. Once you're in their clutches, you just never know when the next attempt's going to happen.
If I'm listening to this conversation and I'm an executive of a small to medium-sized business, the thought that's going through my mind is, oh, this is more for the large corporates and for governments, federal government, state government, etc. I'm just too small a fish in the pond for them to come after me. Even if they demand $50 million, I don't have that kind of revenue, let alone pay that in ransom. Is that a valid concern, or am I as exposed to these type of attacks as a large corporate or a government agency?
100% you are. If not, you're probably more exposed if you're a smaller company. And I'll give you an example. There's a company called Snowflake, which is a database provider that has tens and thousands of small companies that use that as their database. They were breached, and logins were stolen from a lot of the companies, and those individual companies had ransomware attacks launched against them. Ticketmaster was one. There's others. There was 165 companies. So being a smaller company doesn't make you immune. In fact, you're probably more immune because you don't have the same controls that some of the large companies have, the same controls to be able to detect and prevent this. And here's the thing with these ransomware attackers, they basically have a formula for how much they're going to extort a company from, and it's based upon the revenues they believe that company has. So if you're a company that has $1 million in revenue a year, they're not going to try to get you for $50 million. They're going to use a formula that's a percentage of your revenue. They may try to get you for $50,000 to $100,000. They have a formula as a percentage of the revenue because they know what you can afford, and they're going to push you to that limit because they know they'll be more successful. And that's why you can't assume you're not going to be part of the attack spectrum. You need to really understand that you can be a victim of ransomware, whether you're a $100,000 company or a $100 million company or a $100 billion company.
Wow. So everyone can be a victim of this. Now, you quite rightly said that as a small business, I don't have the means to deploy the security measures that a large corporate does. So how should I protect myself? I don't have the staff to be focused on security 24/7. I don't have the budget to buy the Uber security solutions that is in the market, but I have assets of value which might make me susceptible to attacks. So how do I protect myself? What can I do practically to protect my business and my clients?
Yeah, there's 3 things that every business can do, whether you're large or small, they're going to really help. First is training. Get everybody in the company trained on how to recognize phishing emails, get them trained on how to recognize social engineering attempts, and get them trained not to click links. That's something inexpensive, and it's something very helpful in making sure that you kind of stand your ground against these fraudsters. That's not too expensive, by the way. The second is to, whenever possible, turn on all the security controls, whether you're on Amazon or Snowflake or any system that you use. Put your security controls that they provide you, those configurations, to maximum. That means always having 2-factor authentication. You should always have a way that you log in and you're going to get that code to confirm that login. That is like number one. And most of these ransomware, these types of attacks, you can not be the weakest link just by having that turned on. The third thing that you can do is whitelisting. So a lot of these services will allow you to create a whitelist of IP addresses that only those IP addresses are able to access the systems. That's another big thing that a small company can do, is make sure that whitelisting feature is on and that you are employing that for all of the access to the systems. With those three things, you're going to be pretty well covered, and you're going to be able to not be the weakest link, because these criminals are always looking for who's the weakest, and they're going to exploit that.
So if we look at the anatomy of an attack, I always think of it in three circles. So the technology, which is what you talked about at the start, AI being used very heavily for the whole end-to-end process of an attack. The second piece is the security, and security is only secure at a given point in time. There are many vulnerabilities that come with security solutions. So really, we don't have a lot of control over it, but humans who are the weakest link, but can be the strongest link in the chain, we can do something about it with training, with awareness, etc. And this whole phishing scam, the business email compromise scam, it all comes down to human manipulation, social engineering, tricking people into clicking the links that they should not be clicking, but also convincing them to share OTPs and other type of multi-factor authentication security codes that are generated when they shouldn't be sharing. And like you said, it's an inexpensive way to really secure the organization with training, awareness, whitelisting, etc. You mentioned earlier in the call about pig butchering and those type of attacks. Now, these terms may be very new to some of our listeners. I didn't know about it until very recently when I came across some articles and I read it on your blog. What is the vocabulary of attacks that we are looking at? Because it seems like it's a whole different language that is springing up around it.
Yeah, pig butchering is a relatively new type of fraud, but it's a new name for a combination of frauds. So if we think about pig butchering, it actually emerged out of China. It used to be called shazupan, and that's the Chinese term for pig butchering. And what it is, pig butchering is a combination of a romance scam combined with cryptocurrency scam. So the way that it works is you'll typically receive a random text out of the blue on your phone. Somebody that pretends to know you, right? It's like, hey, and typically they'll give you the wrong name. They'll say, hey, Jim, when are we going to get lunch again? And you say, I'm not Jim, in response to the text. And then the pig butcher, who is often pretending to be a woman, but it's actually a man, or could be anybody in any part of the world. And they're just going to start engaging with you in small talk over text. And then they're going to move that text to like a platform like WhatsApp, where they can communicate with you in various channels. And what they're going to do over the course of time is make you fall in love with them. So it's a romance scam. And once you do, they're going to entice you to deposit money into a cryptocurrency platform as an investment. They're going to give you an app. You're going to upload your Bitcoin or your money, and the app is actually going to show your money growing. And they're going to progressively over time get you to put more and more money into the platform. You think you're making a lot of money, but that app is fake. Your money's just being deposited to criminals. And at the end, they've stolen all of your money, and that's when you are butchered. That's when you are over, when they've got all your money, and that's why they call it pig butchering. It's a huge problem. There's an enormous transfer of wealth from Americans, Europeans, and people in the UK to these pig butchers who operate out of Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and the Philippines. And they're stealing billions and billions of dollars.
Wow. That's very scary. So they're stealing millions of dollars from unsuspecting individuals. Are they then utilizing that connection to infiltrate businesses and then compound revenue, fraud revenue, via individuals into business? Is that the gateway?
That is one of the gateways. There is a case here in the United States, Heartland Tri-State Bank in Kansas. It was a small bank, and they pig butchered the CEO of the bank in much the same way that I just described. Through a random text, he began to communicate. He began to take his own money, deposit it into these cryptocurrency platforms. When he ran out of money, he was enticed to start using the bank's money. So he was successful in transferring out $45 million of bank funds to these cryptocurrency platforms. And then the bank toppled. So it actually, these pig butchers were able to start with the individual and then progress it so they were able to actually steal all the money out of a bank. And the bank ceased to operate and the FDIC had to take them over. So yes, they use it as a gateway to get into the larger funds, which are part of these businesses. That's what makes it particularly devastating.
That is very, very frightening, isn't it? And again, how, as individuals, how do we look out for these things? If someone I know is sending me a message, my human instinct is to trust and respond to that message. How do I validate that this friend or my contact hasn't been hacked and therefore I'm not receiving a note from a pig butcher?
Two things. Let's start with the friend that you being spoofed on. You get a message, you think it's from your friend. The number one way to combat that is to call them back. Call the phone number that you know for that person back, because you'll be able to speak to them directly. So just picking up the phone is probably the best way to not get spoofed. And that goes for you get a call and it's one of these ransom attacks where you're hearing an AI voice clone you. It's from your daughter or your son and they're claiming they're being held and kidnapped and you need to pay the ransom. Just pick up the phone and call them back. 99.99% of the time you're going to reach them and you're going to find out it's a scam. But there's a lot of other things that individuals can do. Things that I do. You can put your phone on silence for calls that come from unknown numbers. Most of these scams are going to originate from numbers that you've never got a call from before. In today's age, with all the scams, you can just silence those so you don't even get those. The second thing you can do is turn on some of the robocall apps. I have one on my phone. It's called RoboKiller. And it basically stops any scam call or text that I receive so I don't even get them on my inbox. Just filtering them out, I think, is a great way to stop yourself from becoming a victim.
Yeah, great practical advice. And I think we don't hear about this enough. I feel like there's almost a consumer awareness campaign that needs to be run with exactly the kind of tactics that you have described.
Yeah, I think consumers, especially elderly consumers, don't know what to do. So sometimes family members should take great care to protect their parents, their grandparents, and give them the tools and the education. What I like to do with my mom is completely shut down her phone so she can't get these calls from scammers, just like I described. I think we can all do that for our parents and grandparents to make sure that they're not victims, because they are the number one targets of a lot of these scammers.
My mother gets messages all the time. The other day she got a message to say, your Barclay card is on the way, click here to confirm the address. And thankfully she checked with me, but she could have easily assumed that I had applied for a Barclay card for her and that she was due to receive. So yes, we should all be helping the elders in our family and protecting them from these type of scams. So talk to us about some case studies and real life examples. I read a lot of them on your blog, and I know you have a lot of information about these, but in my view, there are three types of attackers out there. At a basic level, what I call pickpockets. So they will try the basic tools. They will go out there, do the best they can. And if they get some money in the process, great. If not, they'll move on. And then there are these organized crimes, right? Some stuff that we already talked about, targeting banks, targeting governments, etc. And then the third type is the nation state threat vectors, where they are incentivized by governments because there is benefit to be had in that process. Can you just cite us some case studies, some examples for the benefit of our listeners or our audience so that they can look out for these things? Because most people don't know the extent to which the attackers go and the type that they manifest into beyond some of the basics that we are aware of.
Yeah, I think the biggest case study that's been most popularized in the news is the one that is the BEC attack. I think we talked about this one before. This is a really sinister attack. Basically hit any company, large or small. This case was so big, though. This occurred in Hong Kong, and I think it was November of 2023. No, it was February of 2023. Yeah, that's right. And this is pretty recent, right? And what the hackers had done is kind of go through a very sophisticated, organized, and well orchestrated wire transfer scam. And this one, to me, was kind of shocking in how much time they spent preparing for it. The first thing that they did was a lot of homework online. And experts believe they were kind of going through LinkedIn trying to find somebody that worked for an international company. The company's name was Aarti, and they were based in the UK, but they had operations in Hong Kong. So they tried to find a person, like an accountant, somebody that could do wire transfers in the company, and they found that person who was an accountant. And that person, I think it was accounts payable director. And that person was a pretty ripe target because they were relatively junior enough where they wouldn't have access to senior executives potentially. And number two, they had the ability to send wire transfers. So the fraudsters were very smart. But what they did was they engaged in what's called spear phishing. And spear phishing really involves where you're going out there and targeting an individual within an organization with emails. And what they did is they did more homework on LinkedIn and found out who the CFO's name was. And I think the CFO of Aarti was Robert Boardman. So they spoofed an email to the accounts payable director purporting to be from Robert Boardman. And it was an email that said something like, hello, Tien, based on your tenure at Aarti, I know I can trust you to carry out a series of discrete money transfers for me. It's going to be a lot of these, and I'm going to need your help. So imagine your accounts payable director, you get an email from the CFO and you want to do a good job. At first, he didn't believe it, but over the course of time, they were peppering this person with email after email and text after text. They even got him to start communicating via WhatsApp. And they got him to start to believe that it was the CFO. And then on a Sunday morning, he got a Zoom call request from the CFO, and he hopped on the Zoom call. And lo and behold, there's the CFO. And other people from the company started to join the Zoom call. So this isn't something that all of us would do every day, right? You join a Zoom call, and here's a bunch of people from the company. There's the CFO. And then the CFO starts to order him to do things in quick succession. He's saying, I want you to write this down. You need to do this right away. Send a wire transfer to this for this amount. Send a wire transfer to this bank account for this amount. And he got the accounts payable clerk in a rush to send these things out. And he did it through Zoom. The accounts payable director, being a good employee, actually carried it out. And it wasn't until about 3 days later that he realized that the whole Zoom call that he had taken was actually a deepfake. That wasn't the CFO. Those weren't the employees. Even though they looked like people that he'd worked with, it wasn't them. And that company lost $25 million. That's an attack prime example of the types of attack that we're going to see with artificial intelligence.
That's bringing together facial deepfake, voice cloning, live manipulation, social engineering, a whole bunch of different factors together, right?
That's right. That's why BEC attacks, they have the biggest payoff because, like you said, Aarti, they're using social engineering, they're using phishing, they're using spoofing, they're using voice cloning, they're using deepfake video, email, every single thing you can think of, they're using in one large coordinated attack against a major company. That's why it's so scary. Insurance fraud that are being perpetrated using artificial intelligence. In the UK, it's up 400%. Using the power of artificial intelligence, create up to 20,000 fake identities in a single day. The deepfake detectors are falling short of the deepfake generators. And it's just a matter of economics.
Fraud detection technology is 5 years behind fraud creation technology.
The total losses to fraud are 1.3 trillion, and most of that has almost zero cost basis. People in these scam compounds were slaves.
What does that mean? When you say a lot of these people were slaves on the compound, there is return on investment when you lose $25 million.
The old-fashioned methods. Only a small fraction is using artificial intelligence.
I don't know how to protect myself and my business or the organization that I'm working with.
This could all be an AI-generated conversation between me and you. It can be your AI agent talking to my AI agent in my voice using ChatGPT's API and our voice clones to communicate with each other.
And that's all we have time for today. But there is so much more to explore. So Frank will join us again in the next episode. And next time, we will go deeper into the economics and the business of fraud. We will look at some more case studies and examples. And we will ask Frank the million-dollar question: what should we do to keep ourselves and our organizations secure?